Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the show. This morning, we got two guests for you. So we have no stranger to the show, Professor Bruce Pardy, lawyer, constitutional lawyer, of course, has written a Declaration of Independence and a Constitution for Alberta. And we're going to dive in that today with Dr. A.W. Barber, who has written some columns for the Western Standard, a professor at the University of Calgary. And both guests are joining us today. And here is Bruce. You can say hello, Bruce.
Hey, Nadine. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. And Dr. Barber.
Yes. Good morning, and thanks also.
Welcome to the show. And now we have all three of us. So we are going to jump right in because Dr. Barber, you had expressed some concerns, and I think just about refinements more than anything else, about the Constitution that Bruce had written. And what I thought we could start with is, Bruce, if you want to give us just a quick executive summary of the Constitution that you wrote with its, main points and the logic, I thought I would allow Dr. Barber to come back and kind of point out those areas of concern that he had.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Awesome.
And I'd like to start off saying that I really appreciated the piece. I thought it was very well done, and I'm grateful to be able to talk a little bit about it. The Constitution itself is a proposal for what I think the new Constitution of an independent Alberta should look like. And I started with this idea. A lot of Albertans say they want to live in a free country. And thank God for that. So the question is, what does that look like? How do you draft a constitution to entrench a system of governance that provides for actual freedom? Because that's not what we have right now. We don't have it in Canada. We don't really even have it in the US, although the US Constitution is superior to the Canadian one. It's the gold standard, but there are holes and gaps and weaknesses of that Constitution as well. So if you were sitting down with a blank slate, how would you design a constitution that provides actual, genuine freedom for its people? And the first thing to do, I think, is to decide what freedom actually means. And for my money, freedom means that you are not subject to the coercion, that is, the force or threats of force from other people or the state. So that will be the Constitution's first rule. No one, including the state, can use force or the threats of force against other people. So that's the first element. Second element is this. The constitutions that we have, including the Canadian Constitution, and for that matter, the American one, establish a default position. And the default position goes like this. The state, and by the state, I mean all of its bits. I mean the provinces and the feds together, the legislatures, the bureaucracies, the executive branch, the courts, all of the parts of the state together. The state is all powerful. The state can do anything. The state has unlimited subject matter jurisdiction. And then what do? Well, the state is all powerful. We set out exceptions. All powerful, except. And the exceptions include things like charter rights, right? So the state can censor speech, except you have a guarantee of free speech. Now, what does that mean? Well, the courts decide where the line is drawn. But that's the structure. All powerful, except. Now, that structure won't do because it has resulted in the kind of managerial state that we have. And the state today in countries around the West basically manage everything. They manage the people, they manage speech, they manage thinking, they manage commerce, they manage environment, they manage everything. So you don't want that. So what are we going to do about that? We're going to flip the default. And by that, I mean you establish a new position, a new starting position, which is the state can do nothing, has no powers, except. And now we sit down and decide what the exceptions are. In other words, the state does not have the power to provide for the general welfare, the common good, the public interest. Instead, it has very specifically identified roles. And the rules that I've suggested are, number one, keep the peace. That is, enforce the rule against the use of violence. Number two, resolve disputes. That is, have some kind of a court system to resolve disputes between people. And number three, protect the country. You want a military, you want borders. But besides those three things, and there's not going to be very much else. You want a stripped down state, because that stripped down state is the kind of state that provides people with actual, genuine freedom. And of course, the Constitution has a lot of other pieces to it, but maybe I'll just stop with those two.
Yeah, so that's a really good foundation, and it does touch on some of the, I guess, refinements that AW is trying to bring out, I think, in his article with the Western Standard. So, AW, why don't you jump in here a little bit and kind of, based upon what you've read of the Constitution, and I'm sure, there's lots more experiences that we can bring into this. What are your thoughts about an Alberta Constitution? And I'm going to state so clearly today that with the announcement of the budget that was just proposed in Edmonton, with increases and the largest budget we've ever seen in this province. Bruce and I have talked significantly about purging the Canada out of Alberta. And, just transferring power from Ottawa to Edmonton is not going to be good enough, right? And so I think this conversation is very timely, because I think a constitution that is steadfast and truly restricts the power of any government at any level is so fundamental, I think, to maintaining a free society. So, Dr. Barber, I'm going to let you take a few minutes here and just, share some of your thoughts with us.
All right. Well, thank you. First of all, I was very impressed with the principles that were enunciated in the draft Constitution. I believe they're sound. I believe that they are a articulation of what the reality was, or at least closer to it, back in the 1800s for Canada, or the 1700s for the States, on the ability of the government to do things, right? Because back then they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the development that we had, and so the state was actually limited by what it could do. Even if it passed some law, actually enacting that law, enforcing that law became quite difficult, just because they didn't have the mechanisms. Time and space were against them, and those restraints, right, the geographic restraints, the time restraints, and everything that were in place back when our Constitution, or the American Constitution, was written down, are no longer there. Our technology has put us into a very different place, and I think the principles that this draft Constitution enunciated addresses that, right? We can't just assume that the government's far away and they'll just leave us alone, right? Because we know it won't. We know it's everywhere, right? It's telling us what type of light bulb we have to buy. It's dictating this, it's dictating that. And so to really have freedom, right? As Professor has said, you have to flip the script. You have to make the default this kind of negative right? Like the people have the right and the government's restricted. Right? So I think that's very important. So there's no real disagreement in my mind between the principles involved. Where we do get into some considerations is in how we're going to take those principles and apply them in the real world, right? And I agree. It's like I don't want, and I believe most people don't want the government in their face every minute of every day. That's not freedom, right? The government interfering with the marketplace, that's not freedom, right? Freedom is, hey, I want to buy this, and it's a legal thing to buy. I mean, we're not talking about, some like illegal drugs or something. It's a legal thing to buy. I want to buy this. Well, then why can't I? Well, okay, now it's got this restriction on it, and it's got some other regulation on it, and then pretty soon, I can't buy a car. I can't buy a light bulb. Right? That's not freedom, right? Right. So very much so, and it's just a matter of how we do things. And one of the things that I've found throughout my life is that it's extremely important that the words in a document that's going to be governing, right, are well thought out, well selected, and able to decrease the amount of adjudication that's going to take place if there's some difficulty at some point, right? One of the big problems that we have on both sides of our border is, people and companies are spending way too much time and way too much money arguing about stuff, right? And that's because the laws, the regulations, and whatnot are not particularly well written. Right? There's too much ambiguity. There's too much vagueness, and so if we can avoid that, right, then it's going to make life better for everybody, right? So a great example, I would say, is home invasion, right? Okay, if someone invades my home, what's the appropriate response for that? Well, okay, so unless you have personal experience of looking down a loaded gun barrel, you have no idea what reaction you're actually going to have when someone enters your home against your will, right? Okay, and so the appropriate reaction is this has to be stopped, right? So you can say get out, and then you can grab a gun and shoot. Right? And I think both of those are appropriate reactions because the person was invading, right? And if the person respected life and the person respected law, they wouldn't have invaded your home. Right? So, okay. But that's not the case, and I mean, how many times, and it happens in Alberta here even, someone's protecting their home, someone's protecting their property, and then they shoot somebody, especially in the rural community, right? And the next thing you know, they're spending 2 years in the court arguing, and and that's costing them a lot of money, and that's costing a lot of time, and it's and even if they're successful and the court decides that it was an appropriate response to the situation, the punishment, half of the punishment is the process itself, right? And so if you have clearly worded and well thought out documents, you can avoid as much of this as possible. I don't think it's completely avoidable, but I think you can limit how much problems there are, right?
And I think
So,
in a lot of those statements, there's a lot to unpack there because I think the process often is used as the punishment. We saw that with
for sure.
COVID in particular, where, people were made examples. Really, the government was trying to set a precedent, make an example by coming down with the heavy hand of the law. And I think that's really important for people to understand is the law is force. So, Dr. Barber, to your point, definitions matter. The words that are put on the piece of paper matter. Why? Because that's what people argue about. So now in Bruce's Constitution, you had made some reference to, the definitions around proportional, which obviously, the government uses as reasonable limits. So proportional is bad choice of word there, Brucey. I think you brought up a really good point there. But Dr. Barber, how would you choose to represent it any other way, because that's the limitation with words in general. We try to find the best possible choice to reflect what it is that we want, but it seems that no matter what you say, especially in today's day and age, there's always somebody who can take that and spin it in some other
Yeah.
way. So how do we lock down these definitions, these words, so that they actually mean and can hold the test of time? Because Bruce, to your point as well, the United States has a very good constitution, but it worked very effectively maybe for 100 years, but then you see the chipping away of the freedoms and the manipulation. And again, to your point as well, Dr. Barber, the mindset, and the technologies have changed, from when these documents were written to now. So I think what I'll do is maybe, Bruce, shed some of your light, in choice of words, because I know you totally agree. And then I'll let Dr. Barber come back and just let the two of you kind of talk it out a little bit here, about, what's a better choice, or how do we solve some of these other refined problems?
Right. Yes, I think the point is well taken. Right. So proportional is one of those words that is inexact. It's not maybe quite as bad as the word reasonable, but it's getting close. And it essentially gives the power to the court to decide where the line is going to be drawn. So let's use a concrete example. There's a recent case in Lindsay, Ontario, that has made the news, of a man who found an invader in his kitchen with a crossbow. And the homeowner grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed the guy. And the police charged him. Now, charged the intruder as well, but charged him with assault. And that's a very good case where that illustrates the problem when law enforcement is drawing the line too far in one direction. Because in my books, that's a proportional response. You find a guy in your own kitchen had broken into your house with a crossbow. Obviously, their intentions are evil. And so you should be entitled to protect yourself, your family, your home. And if you grab the first weapon that's available to you and you use it, well, then so be it. That's proportional in my books. But we have this word. Now, here's the abstract problem. What we're tasked with in designing a constitution is the task of trying to articulate rules and principles that have two things. Number one, they're concrete. They're specific enough to dictate outcomes. But on the other hand, they are also broad enough to apply to all the different kinds of situations that might apply, right? And the opposite are at the two ends of the spectrum of rules. One set of rules are specific. If you have specific rules dealing with specific situations that say exactly what's going to happen, that's all very well in those situations, but because they're so specific, they only apply to those situations. And so they're no good as general principles. And on the other end, the more vague you get, the more these ideas become mere sentiments and not principles at all. So what you're trying to do is try to find that Goldilocks place in the middle that articulate abstract rules that have the force of rules. That is, they're specific enough to tell you what has to happen, but on the other hand, to be abstract and general enough to apply across the board. And so, yeah, proportional response is a difficult thing. And after all, let me just add this before I hand the mic over to AW. The other difficulty, of course, with any constitution, any written constitution, has an Achilles heel. And that Achilles heel is that they are written in words, necessarily, right? And those words are interpreted by courts. The courts have the power to take those words and tell us what they mean. And of course, the more specific and well-defined you can be, the better. But nevertheless, even when you are pretty good, the courts still have the power to say, well, not in this case. It is impossible to articulate a rule in words that is going to be clear in every single legal situation. It can't be done. So you do have to give the courts some ability to say, well, we're trying to figure out what the meaning of this is in this situation on these set of facts. And you want to restrict their power to reach too far, but the reality is you can't nail everything down.
So, AW,
Yeah.
I think there's some good points there. The law is certainly, if you make it too rigid, it becomes, to the point where there is no flexibility to make a judgment. But from what I've seen of judgments as of recent, I don't know if I want the courts to have a whole lot of, flexibility to use their own judgment. What do you propose here for a solution?
Well, I want to look at two things. One is that, of course, a constitution is not going to be adopted by a nation because a couple of professors sat down and wrote and talked about something. You're going to have a convention, and all these things are going to have to be discussed and voted on, and so that's the usual process, right? But part of that process is taking really accurate records of the conversations that go on, because then you have an idea of what the authors and the disputers and all these people had to say about that particular point, right? And that gives you a much clearer understanding of how the law needs to be applied in cases that aren't, specifically laid out in the law. The other thing is that I think you have to look at the context, and where my problem is with the way things are working presently is that it seems that the weight is being put on the victim, and the grace of the court seems to follow the perpetrator. And I think it should be the other way around, right? So, like I said in my writing, if there's a woman, right, there's a petite woman, and she's confronted with a very large man, right, immediately there is a threat for her, right? It's not two equals, right? If it's, if Bruce and I meet in a dark alley at night, theoretically we're two equals, right? Not to make a false claim here, but anyhow, theoretically, right? But it's not the case. It's not a case with a woman. And we all know this, right? I mean, this is, what is it? Women are 25% less muscular than men, right? And so her ability to withstand anything is negated simply by biology, right? So she feels threatened, and I think that's a reasonable response. And if you feel threatened, then what you do next to protect yourself is also a fairly reasonable response, because you can't get it wrong. Like in someone's coming at you, whether they're going to do harm with their fists or their hands, or they have a weapon, a knife, a gun, or whatever, right? You don't get a second chance, right? Your chances, you stop them first time. Otherwise, your chances are over, right? So I think that type of thing has to be seen. The weight of the problem, the weight of any particular crime has to be squarely placed on the perpetrator, and the grace of the court, or however you want to phrase it, has to be with the victim, right? And that has to be laid out in a very clear manner.
See, I think that example illustrates the problem, though. So I'm not sure that I agree. In the case of the home invasion, what you have is a crime that's in the course of already being committed. So you have somebody who's broken into your house, and if you find them in the kitchen with a crossbow, you know that there's danger. And so I think you should be entitled in those circumstances to respond appropriately, as the fellow in Lindsay did. But if you encounter somebody in a street or an alley or the like that happens to be smaller than you, and they attack you because they fear something, to my mind, that the same reasoning does not apply. So let me give you a concrete example. I remember one time many years ago, I was running, and there was a narrow path that connected streets, sort of like a park-like path. And there was a woman on the path that I came upon. I was behind her, and she was taking up the path. It was a very narrow path. She was taking up the path, and she had headphones on. She was listening to something. And I spoke to her. I said, excuse me, I'm behind you. She didn't hear me. And it was a long path. So having tried to get her attention so I can get around her, I gently put my hand on her shoulder to get her attention. And she nearly jumped out of her skin. And she was angry with me for touching her. And I said, but you have headphones on. I couldn't get your attention any other way. And if she had turned around at that moment and, attacked me or shot me or used bear spray on me, I would have said, that is not a proportional response. You have no idea what my intention is. You may feel afraid. That's a subjective feeling. It's not based upon the facts. And you are the one who blocked my way. So there's all kinds of variation and nuance in these facts. And
Right.
and I grant you that it's a difficult problem, but it's let me give you another example. Compare the situation in Lindsay where somebody breaks into the house with a crossbow to another situation where somebody breaks into a house. Because even that is not necessarily clear. So let's say you have a cabin in the middle of the woods somewhere, and it's winter, and somebody is lost in the woods, and they're freezing to death, and they're trying to find shelter, and they come upon your cabin, and they bang on the door, and you're asleep, so you don't hear them, and they think nobody's home, so they break into your house to try to save themselves from frostbite, and you finally come to, and you think there's somebody in the house, and there is somebody in the house, and you go and find them in your house, and they see you, and you're angry because somebody broke into your house, and they leave, and they run out the door back into the woods, and you take your gun and you shoot them in the back. Okay, that's not proportional, right? So just the fact of a subjective feeling of fear, and the fact that there's a conflict or there's an appearance of an unlawful approach does not necessarily give license to do whatever you want to do in response. All I'm saying is this is a lot of gray. There's a lot of gray here. And
Yes.
the best we can do is try to articulate the idea, the principle, and then sometimes let the court have at it.
So I'm going to interject
so
here
I-
because there's a couple of things in this. I don't think we're necessarily disagreeing. I think IW is bringing out intent, right?
I
And
agree.
Bruce, you're
I agree.
elaborating a little bit more on the fact that you do need to understand somebody's intent. I think from a solutions perspective here, and I want to focus on a solution here a little bit because AW has already made the point, which is very accurate, that our courts often side with criminals. They make it as they turn victims into criminals. And I think that is the wrong approach, period. So I think
Yes.
that's something that we can all agree on that we need to address immediately. That,
Well, yes, but let's be careful too. So I've sometimes put it this way: there is no victim until there is a conviction, because sometimes people allege things that happen not to be true. So you don't know that there's a victim until there's a conviction. The problem is where the lines have been drawn, and I agree with the basic description. But in the Lindsay case, for example, the police charged the homeowner for defending his home and his family. Now those charges have now been dropped, but they should not have been placed in the first place. I mean, it was clear that he was defending his home, and the guy with the crossbow was obviously there for bad reasons. So that should not have arisen. Back to the process as the punishment. That process was punishment, even though he's been now released from the charges. So that shouldn't happen. But on the other hand, there are all kinds of cases in which you should not believe the alleged victim because the alleged victim may not be a victim at all, right? So you have a burden of proof. You have a criminal burden of proof that needs to be met, and before that burden is met, there is no wrongdoing. There is no wrongdoing. I mean, that's one of the purposes of having a legal process.
No, absolutely, and I don't think we're disagreeing with that.
Yeah.
But I think part of the problem has come in recent. Everybody gets charged, and then you have to go through the
Yes.
process, and
Yes.
sometimes it's very
Yes.
obvious as to, like, if somebody came to me and it broke into my house with a crossbow, if I happened to have a gun, which would only be so nice if Canada had those types of rules that we could actually do that. I don't think that would be, and I shot the individual. I don't think that is even questionable. I'm protecting my family. I have a daughter,
I agree.
upstairs asleep.
I
I
agree.
mean, so, but we're not seeing that happen, right? Right now, we have a judicial system that charges everybody, and then it's like, you have to go through the process. And as to Dr. Barber has said, that process
Yep.
is punishment in and of itself. It emotionally,
Agreed.
mentally,
Agreed.
spiritually, and
Yes.
financially, it can bankrupt people. And
Yep.
I think Dr. Barber brought up a really good point when he talked about accurate records of the conversation. Because I think if you read the letters that were written and the dialogue of founding fathers, for example, of the United States, it does provide a lot of clarity. And intent is huge, I think, in law. And we've lost that now. We've gotten too much to the letter of the law. So, AW, why don't you share a little bit here as to what you think, what Bruce just said, and how, because again, I want some solutions. How do we move this forward? We all know what the problem is, and life is gray. That's the problem, right? It's not black and white. It's lived in color.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's very good points. And there's always exceptions that can be thought of, or even taken from papers of different reports and everything. And I agree. There are no perpetrators and there are no victims until the court case has made its decisions, right? So the alleged victim, the alleged perpetrator. But I don't. The idea, whether we're talking about proportional or whatever other word we may want to use, I don't think you can get away from the subjectivity of the situation, right? Yes, like in your case where you were on the path, and the lady was, oblivious to what was going on. Obviously, her reaction, if she would have had some bear spray or something, would have been well beyond what was reasonable to do. But you have to look at the context of these situations as part of the evaluation. I don't think it was unreasonable, for her to be shocked or surprised, and then with a lot of people, when they experience a surprise, they just get angry. But if she would have done more, if she would have taken that anger further, that would have been a bit much. So there's always going to be a subjective aspect to that, and that's what we have to try to limit in our words. We have to try to limit the ability in the court situation to use that subjectivity in a manner that would be disadvantageous to the alleged victim. And that's, so you give her the benefit of the doubt, right? Okay, so like in your case, I'm assuming that you didn't, hit the lady when she started screaming at you. So, and because you give her the benefit of doubt, okay, she was oblivious, and all of a sudden she's brought into to reality a little too quickly, and so you can go, okay, I understand, she got upset because of the shock. But so I think, that's an issue. Yeah. And actually, that's, I wish I was bright enough to think of everything, but mostly I just steal stuff from history, right? But, I was thinking about the founding fathers and the discussions they had when they were, composing the U.S. Constitution. And I've always thought that, the records that they kept were extremely important, because then you can go back and you can really kind of get a sense of how they were thinking about these issues, and that can give us important guidelines when we have to adopt some law for a specific situation. Not always, because even with the most exact records, you're still dealing with words, and words are never as clear as we had hoped. So
I'm just going to bring this back up a little bit higher level. We've gotten a little bit into the weeds here about specific examples, and it just truly illustrates the point that literally life is lived in color. It's not black and white, definitive. There's lots of gray zones. But I mean, the point is here about restricting the power of the government. Is that flipping the script, right? So that it's the people who have the power to live their lives freely. And I think both of you would agree that even Alberta, so Bruce, this is one of the points Bruce has brought up that not a lot of people talk about, but I really want to get your opinion, AW, because here's the reality. Right now we have two governments, and I know we don't like the one in Ottawa, but we do have two governments. And Bruce illustrates this oftentimes in his talks, that we have two governments that, whether we like them or not, but there's a back and a forth that happens. There's some, accountability or debate or conversation, a balance of power, for example, that does at some point they intersect, right? Or interact. If we as Albertans were to concentrate all that power in Edmonton, right? We're concentrating all that power in Edmonton with one government if we were to separate. Here's my concern, and I'm going to use the recent budget. The recent budget, the government is already talking that they can change their own rules, right? They're going to amend their own rules to accommodate their desire, because I'm not even going to say requirement, their desire to increase their revenues for social programs that we cannot afford. And then they're going to increase property taxes. Now, and I went, aside from, a direct tax on production, which I would call an income tax, property taxes are the most malfeasant tax, because these are people, imagine a man or a woman who have lived in their home for 40 years, they've raised their children, and they base property tax on fair market value, not what the individual paid for it, but on a fair market value that's subjective, that can change any year, rules that the government obviously can change at whim, and they could lose their home because they can't afford to pay that. This government, UCP government under Daniel Smith, is proposing to increase a property tax, the largest increase in the history of this province. And even the mayor of Calgary, Farkas, has actually bought this up and said, this is not us doing this. This is the province. And I think this is illustrative of Bruce's point when we talked about this Constitution and the need that it cannot be manipulated. It has to have the power sit with the people, and the government is what needs to be restricted. And I want to bring that conversation back up to that high level, because this is real life. This is happening today. We're seeing governments, we don't like something, they just rewrite the rules. There's no accountability. They get away with literally criminal activity and, things that you and I could never get away with or do without going to jail. They do out in the open. So how do we move things forward in such a way that, and I know there's going to be a transition that needs to happen, but how do we move things forward, in such a way that we can actually get to the point where we could implement a constitution? And AW brought up a convention. I think that's very important. But we got a lot of competing ideas. today as to even what a free Alberta would look like. Who wants to go first?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Ed.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I agree with you. Having one government would prove to be a disaster. And so I would argue that we make divisions of some sort, and have, these divisions have their own sets of rules and whatnot in a way that they can act as a balance to the central government. Right? I think that it's very important you have more than one seat of power, so that when issues come up, they can kind of check each other and try not to get off the rails too often. So that would be to be my way of dealing with it. Second, though, I just want to point out, that the way they're doing this sort of tax thing, right, is that the government tells you what your house is worth, and then they tax it, right? Well, I'm sorry, but your house is worth nothing, right? Until the day you sell it, and then it's worth something, right? Now you can speculate. Well, my house is worth $5 million, or my house is worth 500,000. That's all speculation. It's worth what it is the day you sell it, because that's what the market's going to go for, right? And so taxing people on what the government thinks your house, it's like taxing your fantasy, right? Okay. So I think there's just the property tax in general is problematic because of it's dealing with unrealities that are just advantageous to the government. Right? So okay, that's Bruce. Please go ahead.
Well, in my world, there would be no property tax. I think that's Bruce's point as well. So, I think, Bruce, I want you to touch in a little bit too on the fact that because democracy, for the most part, doesn't work. It is a mob rule, 51%. It's not freedom, right? And I think what we're trying to establish here is the Constitution that would be developed, it almost becomes the dictator. We almost need that dictatorship where there is one rule. There's one ruler, and that becomes the Constitution, and making sure that becomes steadfast.
Yes. So let me contrast two competing models of constitutions. The one that we have and the one that I want. The one that we have is what I would call the checks and balances model. It's the model that the Americans did the best. It's checks and balances. The real checks and balances, the American system, we have them sort of in the Canadian system, but not nearly as well. But the theory there is that you divide the powers up between parts of the state and they act as checks and balances on each other. That worked for a while. It does not work now because they're largely on the same page about stuff. They have their fights, but not in the broad sense of the term. The other model, the one that I proposed, is the no force model. Now, no force means, of course, that your neighbor can't attack you or steal your car. But it also means that the state, who is also committed to that rule, the state cannot make laws and enforce them against you because laws require force. So if there's a no force rule, the only law that the state can enforce against you is the no force rule itself. And that means, combined with this flipped default, keep the peace, resolve disputes, and protect the country. That means that there's not very much that the state can do. There are going to be no social problems, social programs. There's going to be no policy on most things. There's going to be no property taxes because the state has no power to extract them. If you want to extract property taxes, you need to enact a rule that's going to be enforced with force. The Constitution says you can't do that. So there's not very much for this government to do, and therefore not very much need for revenue. We're describing a very minimal state. We're describing a society in which people have control over their own lives, and the state is severely restricted. And yes, there's a court system, but there's a way to restrict the power of the courts too, which my draft gets into. I won't get into it now, but there's a way to minimize the power that any branch and any individual inside the state has over what the Constitution says and means and how it's enforced. So I think you have to move models. You have to move away from checks and balances and towards a much stricter constitutional compulsion that says, sorry, you can't do this. You have no powers, with the exceptions of these, three things.
That's a well taken point. I like that idea. I mean, from the beginning, they just don't have the power to do it. That's really well thought. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really funny because I've had a lot of conversations of late. People go, good government, bad government, because the government is, in the eyes of the people, viewed as one entity, right? It is a dictator, right? So you can have good dictators, and you can actually have bad dictators, good leaders, bad leaders, right? And so, if we have a good leader, we have a great, dictator, everybody's happy. It's when you get the bad one that everybody's upset. And so, how do we really almost have to assign who or what becomes the dictator. And this is how I've shifted my thinking a little bit, Bruce, in our conversations, is that the Constitution now becomes the dictator. It becomes the absolute that says it doesn't matter who individually. Like, to your point, people don't always act ethically or don't always act with good moral judgment. So how do we protect freedom to ensure that what power the government does have, it cannot take that and abuse that or use it to its own best interest?
And I think that's a good criteria for assessing whether or not you have a good constitution. If you assume that you have bad leaders, bad politicians, bad bureaucrats who want to build their own little empires, judges that you might not like, you have people who are governing who would not be your pick. Assume that those are the peoples that you have. If your constitution still works, then it's a good constitution. If it does not work, it's not good enough yet. Your constitution cannot depend upon having the, quote, right people in power. It has to work regardless of who's in power and in spite of their bad faith or ill intent.
Yeah.
AW, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I agree with it. You really do have to assume that there's going to be bad actors, and and so the Constitution has to be able to function properly, even with bad actors in place, because that's just the nature of life. So, right, but I would like to raise another question on a slightly different topic.
Great.
In the draft Constitution, you speak about an armed force, and at least my understanding of an armed force is a professional military, right? And I was wondering if you'd given any consideration to something closer to, say, the Switzerland model, which is more sort of a militia than an actual professional armed force.
Right. No, it's a good question. I would like to think that there would be a militia type potential in Alberta as well. But the way the military arena works now, which is highly technological and automated and so on. So if you went back in time and you imagine yourself in the time of the American Revolution, then you might be inclined to do what they did, which I thought was great, which is to say, everybody has the right to bear arms, which I think should be, clear in the Constitution. And you can make do with a citizen militia, because if anybody attacks you, then the people will gather up their arms and together will repel the force. Going back to your first point, though, we're living in a different age, and countries can conquer you from a distance now. And so if somebody launches a subcontinental missile against you, your militias are not going to be any use. So you also, I think, need some kind of a institutional military, as reluctant as I am to want that kind of an institution inside the state. I think it's probably practically necessary to have something along the lines of a force that can repel the kinds of technology that your enemy nations can inflict upon you. So that's my reluctant response in that respect.
So I'll comment a little bit on that, AW, because I do have a background in aerospace and defense. I owned an aerospace and defense company, worked in Ottawa for 10 years. We did modeling, simulation, human factors engineering. So taking that next level of technology and talk about generational warfare. So, we're in what they refer to now as that Gen 5, right? It's no longer boots on the ground. You still have to hold the ground, but wars are not fought in the same way anymore. They're fought with economics, they're fought with technology, they're fought with drones, so it is a different way. But I do personally, and again, this is just a personal opinion, like the idea of a militia for this reason. People are afraid, right? And I see this in urban centers versus rural centers. I grew up in a very rural area, hunting and fishing with my dad. I'm not afraid of guns. I understand their power. I also understand how to use them. And I think in understanding how to use something, whether it be technology or a weapon or anything else, you gain a sense of confidence with that. And I think a lot of this resistance about people, and even you're seeing the Liberal government in their successful campaign, most of that is urban people who are like demanding that rural people give up their guns. But we're not the problem. Right? I mean, most of these guns are illegal people, and these illegal people who happen to attain them through illegal means, they know how to use them. And so what happens is now you have an imbalance in power. So I really love the idea of, in Switzerland, for example, kids 12, 13, 14 years old, they have shooting competitions. Right? They're not afraid of these guns, these weapons, right? They're taught how to use them. And then they're confident in that. And I think this is where I think our governments have really just dumbed down the population so poorly in both education and skills, life skills, to create them, put them in a position where they are afraid. And now the government has to come to them with all the answers. There's a lot there, but, Bruce,
Well,
AW.
one of the reasons I was going to say, one of the reasons to have armed citizens and a militia is, frankly, to protect yourself against your own government, right? So it's not just protection from the outside. It's generally a good idea for people to understand guns, to know how to shoot them, and to be allowed to possess them if they so choose. That's part of being free, right? So we don't actually need, and this is part of my, the way this Constitution works. If you organize it the way I'm describing, you actually don't need individual rights to be spelled out in the Constitution, because you've already done the reverse. You've said the state can do nothing except, and everything else belongs to the individual. And so restricting your firearms, you keep saying, citizens cannot be armed, is not a thing that would be within the power of the state to do, right? And that's appropriate.
Nadine, I agree with you with this idea of these people in the cities voting to take the guns away from the people. And I always think of those people. It's like people go to you ask where does meat come from, and they tell you it's the grocery store.
Yes.
It comes from styrofoam packages.
That's right.
Hey, well, pretty soon it'll just come from the lab. So we'll
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Or either that or we'll be eating crickets. Oh no, they shut that down, right? That subsidized boondoggle with the federal government didn't work out so well. So, are there any other real questions, like things that you guys want to sort of bring out? Because I mean, this is such an amazing opportunity to have two, and I mean, I don't. I know this is a bit of an intellectual exercise, but you guys are very practical. Like you're very grounded, you have connection. Like so many people do an intellectual exercise and it's all this, fantasy land. But I mean, for us, it's like trying to get down to those solid principles. So, AW, from a very sound, solid principle perspective, what are those things that are just, non-negotiable for you if we were to see, a free Alberta?
So, okay, I think, elected representatives have to have term limits. Right? Now, we can argue it's going to be 4 years, 6 years, 2 years, whatever. That's something that can be debated back and forth, but they have to have term limits because I think we've seen both in Canada and in the States, people get in there and they never leave. And then as Bruce was saying, they're making their own little fiefdom inside the government structure, right? And once that happens, then the people don't have a voice anymore, right? So I think that's extremely important. I really like the idea of flipping the script, right? You have every right. You, the individual, have every right, and the government has its limitations, right? Because with our technology, and it's certainly going to just get worse with AI when it's fully implemented and when the robots take over. It's going to be very easy for the government to do whatever it wants, and so we have to look forward into the future and make sure that things are in place to prevent those types of scenarios playing out. And so I think those are probably two of the most important aspects of a draft constitution.
And Bruce, from your standpoint, obviously we've got 13 points that you've put into your constitution, but from a principle standpoint, same question. What are those completely non-negotiable items, principles that need to be put into place? Because, and again, I as of recently, I begin to think about even like the career politics, but we almost need that one thing, whether it's one person or one thing, and I prefer it to be a thing because a person is malleable, right? They can change their mind. But if we write that constitution, it almost becomes the dictator, right, of everything else. It doesn't matter who you put below it, underneath it, aside. It becomes the authority. And I've come to realize is that we need an authority.
Yeah, so one of the things you have to protect against is giving power to some particular small group of people to decide what the Constitution means. Because, as we alluded to earlier, the Constitution is written in words, and words contain ambiguities and require interpretation. And so what we have right now is an elite in the courts, essentially a permanent elite, and especially at the top in the Supreme Court, with the power to dictate what the words in the Constitution mean, even if when you read those words, you think, well, that's not what it means. It's a clear sentence. That's not what it means. Well, that's what the court said it means. And because the court is the court, that's now what it means. So in our system, the Constitution does not rule. The courts rule. They have the final word on what the Constitution means. And so you have to design a system that does not entrench that kind of power in particular individuals for a long period of time. And that gets back to AW's point about term limits, which I totally agree with. And I've suggested term limits, not just for politicians. That's very important for politicians, but I'm suggesting it for everybody who works in the state, whether you're a politician or a bureaucrat or a judge or a supplier or a receptionist or an ambassador. You have a certain amount of time, and we can argue about what the time is. I suggested 6, maybe 8. That's open to debate. But let's say 8 years. If you serve the state capacity for 8 years, then the Constitution should say you're done. If you serve as a politician for 8 years, you cannot then become a judge. If you are a bureaucrat for 8 years, you cannot then run for office, and so on and so forth. And what are you doing here? Well, we've already disempowered the state's functions. We are now disempowering the people who are inside it. so that there is no incentive for any of those people to build little empires inside their spaces, because they're not going to be there for very long. And there's no point in lobbying these people because they're not powerful to start with. Okay, so you have a revolving door and nobody who's powerful inside the state. They come in to do a job, public service, and they get out. And that way we all participate in the governance of our society, and there are no entrenched powerful people. And if you combine all these elements together, and I think they're all important because they combine to produce an overall result, which is there are no powerful people in powerful positions controlling powerful ideas. It's the people who have the power. And if you have courts interpreting the words of the Constitution, oh, by the way, I should mention one of the other things that you do, your judges are elected, first of all, but for very short terms, and you get rid of the idea of precedent. And I know that's going to sound counterintuitive to people, but precedent is the thing that allows the highest courts to dictate the meaning of the Constitution, right? So you're establishing a system in which each elected judge on a short leash is interpreting the words of the Constitution fresh. And this is to AW's point, which is the words of the Constitution need to be as clear as they possibly can be so that you get the result that the Constitution demands.
And one of the interesting things I think both of you have actually brought up, and AW, you brought it up in your article, and Bruce, I know you have brought this up as well. Military and police are very and interesting, but that is definitely what we all agree is a domain of a government. That's probably the primary reason to have a government, right? Is to ensure that not only can citizens not use force against each other, but to protect your country, to protect your property, your land. And so with that in mind, when we talk about term limits, it's one thing to take a politician who literally this is a civil duty, right? This is a duty. You're an accountant, you're a lawyer, you have some sort of expertise, you decide to get into law to do your civic duty is how I view politics should be. That doesn't mean I necessarily come with a specialized expertise. Now, military, especially when as technologically advanced as it is, we may not necessarily want to lose that pilot who has all the experience. And so maybe the limit that's placed upon them is 15 or 20 years. I mean, those are things that need to be discussed because it is a very specialized skill. And if you're going to pay to develop that skill, you may want to retain that skill. Much to your point, AW, in the article that you made, sometimes there are circumstances when you want that expertise to remain. But, admin and I think politicians who, as my dad likes to point out, one day they're just you and me. It's just Bruce. It's just AW. It's just Nadine. And then all of a sudden they get elected and somehow it's the honorable. Well, what's changed? Nothing's changed. You're the same person you were yesterday, right? You don't have more knowledge because you somehow now work for the government, nor do you have any less. But, so this whole idea of career politics and people coming out of university with a poli-sci degree, polyev, sorry, didn't mean to say that out loud, who their whole experience is nothing but politics, no real business, no real life experience. These are problematic situations when you give these guys, ultimate power. So on that note, I want to get both of your opinions because I know, Bruce, you talked about no corporations, and I've had people comment on that on our previous podcasts. They're like, well, but corporations are the reason we have all these great things today. And I'm like, yeah, it's also the reason we have all these problems today. So maybe I can get Bruce to elaborate a little bit on that. And then AW, maybe you can shed some of your thoughts, ideas, worldview on whether or not we should retain corporations as entities, as persons, or if just the human being is the person.
Right. Okay. So one of the rationales for having a big government is that we need one to protect us against big corporations. Because big corporations concentrate a lot of economic power. They have a lot of power. They have both economic power and political power. And so we need a big government to counteract that power. But here's the thing. Corporations are a creation of the state. Corporations do not exist unless legislatures pass statutes that say You can have a corporation, and a corporation is going to have these powers. And the powers that they give corporations, and the reason for having them, is because they can do things that human beings cannot do. You can sell shares, you can concentrate wealth, you can give your shareholders limited liability. And so when corporations compete against human beings, it's an unfair fight. Corporations have more powers than the human beings do. And because of the legislation, those corporations become legal persons. They can do anything that a human being can do: own property, make contracts, sue, and be sued. So the solution to that, in my mind, if you are describing a free country in which the government does not interfere in marketplaces, in the transactions that people do, then there are no entities that the state creates. And the first and most common one is corporations, but there are a lot of kinds of entities that have corporate status or other legal status: unions, trusts,
Mhm.
nonprofits. These are all legal entities that the state creates. So if you want a truly free country, you say to the state, this is not one of the powers that you have. Stand aside. The people can do whatever they want. They can make contracts, they can make deals, they can cooperate, they can run businesses together, but they do so as human beings, and they act on their own behalf. And if people want to invest in those businesses, then great. But you do not get to impose your preference for limited liability upon other people who are not part of your organization, right? So that's part of the rationale for saying, if you're serious about a free country, then you do not allow the state to make up things, including corporations.
AW, what are your thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, it's a wonderful idea. Absolutely wonderful idea. I would add a little bit to it. The state doesn't just make corporations. The corporations corrupt the state because
Absolutely.
they can focus, finances. They can, or like unions can get out the vote,
Yep.
and so it's very problematic. I would want to point out something. It seems to me, okay, the Great Generation, right? Go back to the Great Generation, whatever they were, right? Like they were farmers, they were factory workers, whatever they were before the war, right? They all came back from the war, at least the ones that did come back from the war, were all very practical people because they saw way too much to be lost in fantasies about all sorts of things, right? And I think that played out. It played out in our corporations. It played out in our universities. It played out in our politics. You had this group of people who had gone through an experience that made sure they had to be grounded. And we lost that in the post-war period, right? Because most people nowadays in Canada don't have military experience, don't have war experience. And the last major war that actually I think it was a police action, but anyhow was the Korean War, right? Yes, Canadians did participate in Afghanistan, but that was a very limited number of people. They didn't have a general call up for the draft for that. So most people just don't have that type of grounding, and I think that's very important. A lot of smart people, and there's lots of interesting ideas we can kick around. Right? Where the real problem is where the rubber hits the road, and for a lot of people, they're in the Jetsons flying car. There's no rubber hitting the road at all.
Yeah, and that becomes the hard part today, even for the Alberta separation, because I feel there's a lack of leadership, and some of the so-called proposed leaders of this movement, are making statements, claims that they want to free Alberta, but yet by nature of their very statement, they've set it up for failure before it's even gotten an opportunity to get off the ground. Because and this is why I love having the conversation with people like both of you. If we truly want freedom, it's going to involve a significant shift in how we think and mindset, because we really do have to dismantle, the public institutions, including things like central banks, and how we do our banking and
Yes.
finance.
Yes. Yes. 100%. Yes.
That's core to this. Our
Yep.
public institutions like education, healthcare, they need to be completely dismantled and a whole new system put into place that better serves the power, that empowers the individual, not corporations. And, so I want to hear, so you're listening to the podcast, please do share your comments with us, because the one on corporations has been, I've gotten that one a number of times from individuals who are like, well, but I own a corporation and I'm able to do this and I'm able to do that. But here's the point. It does limit your ability to compete. Like, we can't compete with the Monsantos. We can't compete with the Bayers. We can't compete with these. And then you have the whole financial industry that's been built around all of this, that is, got power, way beyond anything that they should ever have. So, and then they use that power literally against us. So, those are all things that, please do share your comments. If you like this video, please do share it. Happy if there's topics you want us to bring up, let us know. So on a final note, I want to give each of you, a couple of minutes to just share any final thoughts. And, maybe we should do this again narrow in on some of these topics. So
Great. Go ahead, Adelma.
No, you go first, please.
Okay. Well, so I just want to emphasize this point, Nadine, which you alluded to earlier, which is that the independence challenge for Alberta is twofold. The first is to escape Canada, and the second is to get Canada out of Alberta. And those two things are different. In the first, you're escaping Ottawa, which is important. It's good. But there's an awful lot of Canada inside Alberta. You have to purge the Canada that is inside Alberta, because Alberta has a lot of Canada in it. It has a managerial state. It is governed by a Westminster system. It has a crown. It has, a way of governing that incorporates all the Canadian features that we've been talking about. The point of independence, at least in my books, is to be able to start again. And you have to take that seriously. Otherwise, what's the point?
Very good.
BW.
So I'm gonna take it in a slightly different direction. Although I do believe we have to start again. But what I want to focus on is the education. We have to educate people to be free. There's far too many people who are very willing to allow others to essentially dictate, what their life is going to be. Sort of go along and get along type of mentality, and that's really not going on, right? We assume, I think, falsely, that universities and whatnot is where people are, put into the situation where they're going to be debating, the multiple sides of issues and all of this. But actually, that's not really going on very much anymore, right? And so I think we have to write, K through 12, right? Preparing young people to be free citizens. And when you get to university, even more so, but, at a deeper level. Something akin to, someone writing a draft constitution and thinking, well, what principles are really important, and then, how can we apply these in a real world type of scenario? Right? I think there's, I'm not going to comment on the prospects of voting for independence or not. I have no idea how the people will decide. I'm glad that people do get to decide, but I'm not going to predict it. But I do think that we really need to have an education reform so that people understand what freedom is and that it's something worth, because everything costs, right? Everything is a balance of pluses and the minuses, and that actual freedom is worth whatever the downside might be. Right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Education has been, so, it used to be learn how to read, learn how to write. It was about life skills. It was about preparing our children to go out into the real world, and be successful. And today, to use that term, what hard times create strong people, good times create weak men. We're there, right? It's people haven't had the hardships to have to endure, and we've created a generation that is incredibly weak. I'm offended because you said something. I mean, in when I grew up, it was like, yeah, sticks and stones break my bones, but names will never hurt me.
Exactly.
And this is where we've got to get back to, I think, some common sense. And there's nothing more, likely to do that than I think the hard times. And I think we do have some hard times ahead of us. But to our conversation, even with or without independence, there's value in this conversation simply because the government that is there are things that they could be doing today that they are not doing. They are going, this Alberta government, and I'm sure Nenshi, if he ever saw this, would be like, oh, she's on my side. No, I'm not. Right? But this government is very socialist. It is a very managerial state. It's not solving the problems. It's just repeating the problem. Right. It's and worse yet, it's putting more money behind the problem. So I think realistically here, the things that we've talked about today, if the government of today would just start implementing, just tackle one or two of these things and start implementing them, I think that brings Alberta to a freer, more prosperous position. Because right now, I think those are just slogans that they throw around and do no actions to follow them up.
Well, a lot of it is they're playing whack-a-mole, right? And they might change the person who's doing the whacking, but they didn't fix the problem. Right.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being with us this morning, sharing us your thoughts and ideas. I think, I wrote a book, Alberta Rising. I'm not sure if you're aware, AW, but I wrote it because people looked at me and went, how do I talk to my neighbors? How do I talk to my friends? To your point about education. And even when you give free people today an opportunity to express themselves, sometimes they don't even know where to start. So much of my book talks about public education and gives different examples around the world as to how things, other people are doing things, things that I don't even think necessarily we should be doing, but it is a door opener, an opportunity for people to kind of go, oh, okay, well, geez, Saudi Arabia doesn't charge, income tax. How do they do that, right? And I think that's the key, is at least to create an open mind, because a closed mind always says no.
That's right.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, indeed. Thanks. It's great.
Wonderful. Well, there you have it, guys. Just some more tantalating ideas to kind of throw out there. Two incredibly intelligent, they're university professors. When we talk about intellectual debate, it needs to be grounded in reality. And I think today's conversation was exactly that. So hopefully you take away some points, some things that you want to share with your friends, your neighbor. Please do like, please do share, please do subscribe to the channel. It certainly does help us. And comments, by all means, leave us your comments, and we will hopefully be able to get to address any questions that you may have and refine those speaking points. So God bless you all.